This is a guy who liked to call himself the Great Beast 666. What his wish was that was never fulfilled was to be another Christ.
This is a man whose name still evokes fear and fascination over a century later. He called himself the Great Beast 666, a title that seemed designed to shock and terrify. A self-proclaimed magician, mystic, and poet, Aleister Crowley's public persona was crafted to provoke. Newspapers labeled him the wickedest man in the world, a corrupter of morals, a symbol of decadence, a heretic. But what if everything the world believed about him was a lie? Recently uncovered intelligence files have revealed a startling possibility: Crowley may not have been the villain history painted him to be. Operative AC, a name whispered in secret wartime records, could be the hidden identity of the man the world feared. Historians are now revisiting Crowley's life, examining intelligence dossiers, wartime propaganda documents, and international press archives. The evidence suggests something extraordinary. Crowley may have been a covert intelligence operative, hiding in plain sight behind his reputation as an eccentric occultist. What if the infamous Great Beast, the man who seemed to worship chaos, was actually orchestrating it for someone else? For decades, his public persona, a flamboyant, scandalous, and morally audacious figure, was considered the very proof of his villainy. But new research shows that this reputation might have been the perfect disguise. Every ritual, every outrageous publication, every scandalous act could have been part of a carefully calculated plan to manipulate perception and influence events. Crowley's life, long seen as a chaotic journey of defiance, now appears as something else entirely. The man branded the wickedest in history may have been a master of misdirection, a pioneer of psychological warfare, and a covert agent whose most dangerous weapon was not magic, it was belief itself. Aleister Crowley was not always the Great Beast. Before the mysticism, the theatrics, and the scandal, he was Edward Alexander Crowley, a quiet boy born in 1875 in Leamington Spa, England. His upbringing was strict, devout, and rigid. Crowley's father, a traveling preacher of the Plymouth Brethren, enforced a life of absolute obedience, where every action was measured against Scripture. Prayer and piety structured his existence. Wealth was not comfort, it was evangelism. But childhood was not always obedience. When Crowley's father died in 1887, the carefully constructed world around him crumbled. In the aftermath, young Edward began questioning the authority and morality he had been taught to revere. His mother called him the Beast, a term of condemnation meant to shame him into submission. Instead, he embraced it, transforming humiliation into identity. This was no simple rebellion. It was Crowley's first act of self-reinvention, a rehearsal for the dual life he would later inhabit. Where once he prayed for salvation, he now sought mastery over perception, belief, and identity. He saw faith not as truth, but as a mechanism to influence behavior. By the time Edward Alexander became Aleister Crowley, the transformation was complete. The new name was theatrical, unforgettable, a symbol of control. It allowed him to split himself into two, the devout child who had known authority, and the great beast who challenged it. And with that split came access to literary circles, social elites, political movements, and, as later revealed, intelligence operations. What looked like rebellion was actually the careful construction of a man who understood how myth could mask reality. Crowley's true work, historians now argue, began in 1914 when he arrived in New York during the height of World War I. To the public, he appeared as a flamboyant, eccentric expatriate writing for the International, a pro-German publication promoting anti-British sentiment. His articles were so outrageous that even German sympathizers found them absurd. But historian Richard Spence's research across British, American, and Italian archives suggests a different story. Crowley's extreme writings were not acts of treason, they were deliberate misdirection. By portraying Germany as ruthless, absurd, and morally bankrupt, he helped turn American public opinion against the Central Powers. Every scandalous headline, every shocking declaration, every article supporting the sinking of the RMS Lusitania was carefully calculated. The genius of Crowley's operation lay in the paradox of perception. No one would suspect the great beast, a man so publicly reviled, of serving British interests. His scandalous persona became operational camouflage. Hidden within coded correspondence, historians have traced references to Operative AC, aligning Crowley's movements with covert propaganda campaigns. Crowley's work in New York also introduced a pattern that would repeat throughout his life: the use of theatricality as intelligence tradecraft. His extreme personality made him untraceable. Newspapers portrayed him as dangerous, insane, and immoral. Meanwhile, he was gathering intelligence, influencing opinion, and infiltrating networks that no conventional agent could touch. The very infamy that seemed to undermine him was, in fact, his most effective shield. Crowley's New York operations were just the beginning. His journey then took him to Spain and Italy, where his occult identity became even more critical to his work. To outsiders, he was the eccentric mystic, the wandering poet, obsessed with rituals and hidden truths. Candles, symbols, incantations, these were the hallmarks of his performances. But his diaries tell another story. Within these rituals were carefully controlled experiments in psychological manipulation. Crowley recorded how gestures, words, and symbols affected behavior, obedience, and truthfulness. Historians now interpret these activities as early forms of psychological operations, precursors to the formal programs later developed in intelligence agencies. His great beast persona provided perfect deniability. To observers, these gatherings were harmless mysticism. To intelligence historians, they were a covert laboratory for influence. Crowley moved effortlessly among diplomats, radicals, and revolutionaries. He collected information and tested influence tactics under the cover of eccentricity. Every ritual, every theatrical flourish was functional. He measured reactions, tested susceptibility to suggestion, and honed methods of persuasion. Crowley was not a charlatan but a strategist experimenting with perception. And through it all, the public narrative remained one of chaos and indulgence, concealing the method behind the madness. Crowley's work was not limited to collecting intelligence. He became an early architect of psychological warfare, testing how propaganda could manipulate belief and behavior. His essays in the International weren't simple support for Germany, they were designed to undermine it. By exaggerating German atrocities and imperial ambitions, he made the propaganda appear extreme, absurd, and implausible. American journalists cited his writings as proof of Germany's immorality. Political commentators dismissed the publication as unhinged, not realizing that Crowley's strategy had succeeded. He had weaponized exaggeration, turning it into a tool of sabotage. His flamboyant public persona was integral to this paradox: the more outrageous he appeared, the more effective he became. Crowley's intelligence work demonstrates an early understanding of what modern agencies would later formalize as psychological operations. Ritual, performance, and myth were converted into tactical instruments. The Great Beast was a persona engineered for operational freedom, a living example of how identity itself could be weaponized. Historians have traced Crowley's network across decades and continents, revealing connections to prominent figures in British intelligence, including Maxwell Knight, the legendary spy master. Crowley's infamy gave him access that conventional operatives could never achieve. Mystics, radicals, diplomats, and aristocrats all interacted with him without suspicion. One of the most intriguing episodes involves Rudolf Hess. The Nazi deputy Führer had an obsession with astrology and esoteric symbolism. When he flew solo to Scotland in 1941 on a supposed peace mission, British intelligence considered consulting Crowley to understand Hess's psychological motivations. While the full extent of Crowley's involvement remains debated, his proximity to these events underscores his unique position as both observer and influencer. The Great Beast persona was functional tradecraft. It allowed Crowley to navigate political, occult, and radical networks without detection. The myth of the wickedest man alive became his operational asset, a cover that enabled him to collect intelligence, test psychological manipulation, and shape perception across multiple theaters of influence. Crowley died in 1947, but his legacy of secrecy did not end with his life. Files that should have verified or disproved his espionage work vanished. MI5 and MI6 claimed no records existed, and for decades, scholars dismissed Crowley's intelligence connections as legend. However, fragments uncovered in American military archives revealed references to British intelligence files detailing his cooperation during World War I. MI5 later admitted the files had existed but were deliberately destroyed. Historians interpret this as deliberate erasure, designed to protect government secrecy and political reputations. Crowley's disappearance from the records mirrors the careful construction of his dual identity. Just as the Great Beast persona shielded him from public suspicion, the absence of official files shielded him from historical scrutiny. Every layer of myth, every scandal, and every theatrical act was part of a life built around concealment and controlled revelation. The Great Beast, long dismissed as a mad occultist, now emerges as a prototype of modern psychological operations, a figure who understood that perception could be as powerful as force, and that myth could be weaponized in the service of statecraft. The evidence that has emerged does more than reinterpret Crowley's life, it reshapes our understanding of modern intelligence, propaganda, and psychological influence. Crowley's rituals, writings, and public antics were not eccentricities, they were tools, engineered to manipulate perception and influence human behavior. Analysts now see his philosophical writings as structured frameworks for conditioning thought, anticipating methods used in contemporary psychological operations. Every scandal, every public provocation, was a layer of operational security. While newspapers obsessed over his excesses, Crowley met with contacts, exchanged coded messages, and moved unnoticed through political networks. Crowley's life reveals the merging of myth and statecraft, a demonstration of how governments can weaponize culture, belief, and spectacle. The Great Beast was never merely a rebel or heretic, he was an operative, a master manipulator, and a pioneer of psychological influence. For historians, the implications are staggering. Crowley's manufactured persona shows that the boundary between myth and governance can be deliberately blurred. By embedding himself in multiple spheres, occult, literary, political, Crowley created a living illusion that advanced strategic objectives, demonstrating that deception and performance can be as powerful as conventional intelligence. And the question now arises, if Crowley, the most infamous occultist of his era, lived a double life of such calculated precision, what other historical figures might be hiding secrets behind the stories we have long accepted? Crowley's life forces us to reconsider the very nature of history, myth, and the unseen forces shaping the world. Aleister Crowley, the Great Beast 666, was not merely a figure of scandal, occultism, or literary eccentricity. He was an operative, a strategist, and a master of misdirection. His public persona, a chaotic, scandalous, and morally transgressive figure, was a carefully crafted shield. Beneath it, historians now argue, lay a methodical intelligence operative conducting some of the earliest known experiments in psychological warfare. Every aspect of Crowley's legend, rituals, writings, performances, served a purpose. The chaos, the scandal, the reputation as the wickedest man in the world were all tools of perception management. Crowley turned public condemnation into operational cover, weaponizing his infamy to achieve objectives that remain only partially understood today. The disappearance of official records after his death mirrors the life he carefully orchestrated. Layers of myth, theater, and misdirection concealed a man who understood that the world could be influenced as much by belief and perception as by policy or propaganda. His work foreshadowed modern psychological operations and the sophisticated use of myth in statecraft. Today, scholars recognize Crowley not as an outcast, but as a pioneer of influence, a figure who blurred the line between magic and statecraft, ritual and manipulation, myth and intelligence. His life forces us to question everything we think we know about history, legend, and the power of perception. Aleister Crowley's real identity was never the villain the world feared. It was far more unsettling, a master of the unseen, a manipulator of belief, and a covert architect of influence. And with this revelation, one question remains: what other truths lie hidden behind the myths we have long accepted? Crowley's occult activities, long dismissed as mere theatrics, now reveal a deeper purpose: experimentation and influence in human behavior. The symbols, rituals, and incantations he practiced were not only spiritual exercises, they were methods for testing the limits of suggestion, obedience, and perception. Historians analyzing his diaries discovered meticulous records of interactions with followers, diplomats, and radicals. Crowley observed reactions to specific phrases, gestures, and ceremonial sequences, measuring compliance and emotional response. To the untrained eye, it appeared as mystical experimentation. In reality, it resembled behavioral psychology conducted under the guise of spirituality. This duality, public occultist, private strategist, allowed Crowley to access networks of influence others could not. Radical groups, nationalist movements, and even political operatives sought his counsel, unaware that they were participating in a live intelligence laboratory. Every ritual became a controlled experiment, every symbol a tool for subtle manipulation. In this light, Crowley's mysticism becomes operational. His great beast persona was not only camouflage, it was a weaponized identity, engineered to disarm skepticism, encourage trust among radicals, and mask covert objectives. He was, in essence, performing psychological operations decades before formal programs existed, demonstrating an uncanny understanding of human cognition, belief, and perception as instruments of influence. Across continents, Crowley's movements reveal a systematic pattern of intelligence work. He was not wandering aimlessly as many biographies suggest. He was a strategic actor navigating a complex web of political, occult, and social spheres. In Italy and Spain, Crowley mingled with nationalist factions, German agents, and British operatives. His presence in these circles was never accidental. By crafting the great beast persona, he gained access to otherwise restricted networks, collecting intelligence and shaping opinion under the guise of eccentricity. The pattern extends into correspondence and published writings. Letters dismissed as flamboyant ramblings now align with movements of verified intelligence agents, hinting at covert coordination. Crowley's work demonstrates early integration of human intelligence, cultural influence, and psychological strategy, a blueprint for modern espionage methods. Even his most publicized scandals had a purpose. By drawing attention to his eccentricities, Crowley became untouchable. No government suspected him, no rival agent anticipated his moves. His operational freedom relied on the audacity of the great beast, a persona that transformed social disdain into tactical advantage. In essence, Crowley invented a new model of the agent, one who hides in plain sight, whose legend protects the mission. Crowley's experiments with perception were not theoretical. They shaped the real-world decisions of governments, diplomats, and radicals. By influencing the beliefs and behaviors of key figures, he subtly steered political outcomes. Historians now recognize that Crowley's rituals, writings, and persona were strategic tools of psychological warfare. His life demonstrates that myth and legend can be weaponized, that public scandal can serve as operational cover, and that identity itself can be engineered to serve political ends. Crowley's approach prefigured modern propaganda techniques and the systematic manipulation of belief that intelligence agencies would formalize decades later. His work shows the power of controlled perception, the ability to bend reality not through force, but through influence, spectacle, and narrative. By the end of his life, Crowley had created a blueprint for covert psychological operations, one that combined theater, manipulation, and intelligence in a way that modern operatives would later emulate. The great beast was no longer merely a rebel or mystic. He had become a prototype for the ultimate intelligence operative, a man whose greatest weapon was the world's misunderstanding of him. Even after his death in 1947, Crowley's impact persisted. The destruction of files and the careful erasure of his intelligence role ensured that the public narrative remained one of scandal, occultism, and moral deviance. Yet, the fragments that remain hint at a network of influence that extended far beyond what scholars once imagined. Letters, coded messages, and memoirs suggest that Crowley's techniques of manipulation were studied, adapted, and quietly employed by intelligence operatives long after he was gone. In effect, Crowley became a silent architect of modern psychological strategy, demonstrating how culture, belief, and narrative could be harnessed to achieve political ends. His legend was not an accident, it was a template for influence, a guide for operating in the shadows while shaping perception in plain sight. Crowley's life forces us to reconsider the very nature of historical truth. What appears chaotic, scandalous, or eccentric may, in reality, be highly controlled, calculated, and influential. The great beast may have died, but his methods live on in the tools of modern intelligence, propaganda, and psychological operations. If Crowley's life was a blueprint for covert influence, the implications are staggering. How many other figures in history, dismissed as eccentrics, rebels, or villains, were operating with hidden agendas? How much of what we accept as biography is actually carefully orchestrated narrative? Crowley's story also reshapes our understanding of power itself. Influence, myth, and perception are tools as potent as armies or governments. His life demonstrates that the control of belief, through ritual, persona, and storytelling, can shape decisions, manipulate allies and enemies, and alter history. Historians are only beginning to untangle the full extent of Crowley's impact. The surviving fragments hint at global networks, psychological experiments, and intelligence operations that have been obscured for decades. His methods anticipated modern psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, and even techniques used in corporate influence today. Crowley's life asks a chilling question: if the great beast could manipulate entire networks under the guise of eccentricity, who else might be hiding behind the facades we take for granted? The search for hidden influence, deception, and the true architects of history may have only just begun. Crowley's genius lay not only in his daring acts but in his mastery of misdirection. While the world focused on his flamboyant lifestyle, his occult rituals, and his scandalous writings, he quietly conducted operations in the shadows. His public persona, the great beast, the heretic, the immoral mystic, was more than a disguise. It was a tool designed to draw attention away from his true work. Every outrageous statement, every drug-fueled escapade, every headline-grabbing stunt served to erase suspicion from his covert actions. Historians now suggest that Crowley was a pioneer in the use of perception as a weapon. By cultivating chaos and infamy, he created a space where his movements could go unnoticed. Where a conventional spy would be scrutinized, Crowley thrived. He understood that the greatest cover is not secrecy, but notoriety, that the more the world fixated on the absurd, the less it questioned the calculated. In wartime New York, in the salons of Spain and Italy, Crowley's misdirection allowed him to influence opinion, collect intelligence, and test psychological tactics. His actions demonstrate an early understanding of what modern operatives now call operational deception, a deliberate shaping of perception to achieve strategic advantage. Crowley's rituals were more than spiritual exercises, they were laboratories for testing the human mind. He meticulously observed how symbols, words, and gestures influenced emotions, behavior, and decision-making. Historians analyzing his diaries found notes on subtle manipulations, how the placement of a candle affected attention, how repeated phrases could shape belief, and how ceremonial performance influenced compliance. Crowley experimented with expectation and perception, measuring outcomes with scientific precision. His magical experiments now read like manuals of psychological influence. He observed followers and diplomats alike, testing their susceptibility to suggestion and their responsiveness to authority, symbolism, and belief. Every interaction was data, every ritual a controlled study in manipulation. In this context, Crowley's occultism becomes a prototype for behavioral operations. His great beast persona was both mask and method, giving him unrestricted access to networks that conventional agents could not enter. Crowley's work anticipated techniques used decades later in modern intelligence, showing a profound understanding of human behavior as a strategic tool. Crowley's espionage activities were not isolated. Evidence suggests he was part of a broader network of operatives, including some of the most influential figures in early British intelligence. He crossed paths with Maxwell Knight, the famous spy master who would inspire the character of M in James Bond. Through these connections, Crowley accessed intelligence streams, social circles, and political movements that were otherwise impenetrable. Historians now see Crowley as a link between radical movements, occult societies, and formal intelligence operations. His reputation gave him credibility in unusual circles while disarming suspicion from official agencies. The Great Beast, once a figure of ridicule, became a bridge between worlds that conventional operatives could not navigate. This network was not limited to Europe. His work in New York, Spain, and Italy reveals a coordinated approach to intelligence gathering and psychological influence. Crowley was not a rogue actor. He was embedded, operating under the radar, shaping events across continents with the perfect combination of notoriety and access. One of Crowley's most sophisticated strategies was the use of exaggeration as sabotage. By presenting extreme, outrageous support for Germany during World War I, he effectively discredited their propaganda in the eyes of the American public. Articles justifying attacks, celebrating imperial aggression, or mocking Britain were so excessive that even German sympathizers questioned them. Crowley weaponized his own absurdity, turning flamboyance into strategy. This technique, publicly supporting a cause to make it appear implausible, demonstrates a mastery of perception. Crowley understood that influence was not always about what is true, but about what is believed. By controlling the narrative through exaggeration, he achieved objectives invisible to observers. The propaganda paradox illustrates a central theme in Crowley's life, that chaos can be controlled, notoriety can be strategic, and myth can be operational. His life provides a blueprint for using the unexpected and the theatrical as tools of intelligence. If Crowley was a covert operative, the implications for history are staggering. His manipulations did not end with intelligence collection, they shaped decisions, perceptions, and alliances across the early 20th century. From influencing American opinion during World War I to subtly interacting with radicals, diplomats, and even figures like Rudolf Hess, Crowley's reach was extraordinary. Every public scandal provided cover for covert operations, allowing him to move freely and test psychological influence in real-world conditions. Historians now suggest that Crowley's methods foreshadowed modern intelligence practices, psychological operations, behavioral influence, propaganda, and narrative control. His experiments with belief, ritual, and symbolism laid the groundwork for strategies that would later become institutionalized in intelligence agencies. Crowley's life challenges how we understand power. Influence, perception, and myth can be as potent as armies or governments. The Great Beast persona was more than character, it was a tool, a weapon, and a shield, enabling Crowley to operate at the intersection of myth and statecraft. Crowley's involvement in occult societies was not just about mysticism, it was a strategic cover for intelligence work. The secretive networks of magicians, spiritualists, and ceremonialists provided the perfect environment to observe, influence, and gather information from powerful individuals without raising suspicion. Historians note that these societies were attended by diplomats, military officers, and wealthy patrons. To outsiders, Crowley's interactions appeared as part of mystical gatherings, complete with elaborate rituals and theatrical performances. But in reality, they functioned as meeting points for information exchange. Each ritual, each symbolic gesture, was a calculated act designed to study behavior, test loyalty, and subtly manipulate outcomes. Crowley's reputation as the Great Beast allowed him unrestricted access. No one expected a heretic, drug user, and provocateur to be operating as an intelligence operative. He could move freely among influential circles, extracting valuable intelligence and testing psychological techniques in a live environment. These societies also offered an ideal environment for experimentation in suggestion and influence. Participants often trusted the occult leader, interpreting his instructions as spiritual guidance rather than potential manipulation. Crowley exploited that trust to observe patterns in human behavior, gaining insights into decision-making processes, susceptibility to persuasion, and emotional responses. In effect, the Great Beast persona transformed secret societies into laboratories for intelligence work. Crowley's public notoriety became the ultimate camouflage. What historians are now uncovering suggests that these interactions were not casual eccentricities, but integral